University years 1899 to 1904, from The Raven of Zürich, the Memoirs of Felix Somary, by Felix Somary. Podcast by Archie Henderson. I was 17 when I enrolled as a student in the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the University of Vienna. Many in America would consider that somewhat young, but the gymnasium was the equivalent of high school and college. Nowadays, almost everywhere, law and political science are separate disciplines. But despite the intellectual specialization of our studies, their thoroughness could hardly have been surpassed elsewhere. It had been 84 years since the Congress of Vienna, and both Europe and America basked in the long peace and looked down on the Austrians as incompetents, immature, patiently enduring a tyrant's yoke. The reality was quite different, for the big issues that we were struggling over in Austria had not been dealt with in other countries. On the contrary, they had not even surfaced in those countries, and were to do so only decades later. Nationalism, political anti-Semitism, even communism were already fighting issues with us, while in the rest of the world the curious duality of liberalism and imperialism held sway. While all the rest, in their smug peace and quiet, looked down at the Austrian turmoil as if at some curiosity, we young people felt ourselves at the very center of political events. For our world was far more real than the other. We didn't discuss, we fought, and not as outsiders imagined over questions of the day before yesterday, but about those of the day after tomorrow. When in later decades the new barbarism came flooding in, it surprised the West. For us, it was a familiar phenomenon. We had seen it churning with wild and uninterrupted turbulence at the heart of a highly developed and refined civilization. I say we, meaning the entire intellectual youth of Vienna at that time. We stood at a decisive turning point in history and felt it in our innermost being. Vienna University in those years gave the impression of a battlefield. At the entrance to the monumental building was a spacious auditorium, and there, almost daily, fights of the most savage kind, with fists and sticks, took place between students of various nationalities and parties. The losers were pushed out of the auditorium, and a struggle went on along the two ramps that led to the street, until the stone balustrades gave way, and the howling mobs found themselves on the street itself. There the police intervened and put a stop to it. Since the Middle Ages, the university had enjoyed immunity from any state intervention, a right which the government respected punctiliously. But precisely at the point where the university boundaries ended, the most strict law and order were insisted upon. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which contained the oldest German universities at Prague and Vienna, was justly proud of its tradition of academic freedom. We have learned to value these medieval values now that we have been forced to experience how the attempt at universal freedom ended in total slavery. There was a continual struggle at the university between the Pan-Germans and the Austrian Germans, between Germans and Czechs, between anti-Semites and Jews, and along with that, there was the sharp conflict between members of the Christian Socialist Party, the coalition of lower middle class and peasants, and the socialists. The West did not understand the nature of the social strife that went on in Austria. The liberal bourgeoisie, which still ruled unchallenged in France, England, and America, had been squeezed out of the Austrian parliament. In addition to the national parties and the social democrats, a specifically Austrian party had been formed, which called itself Christian Socialist. The Social Democrats in Austria were the largest Marxist party outside of Germany and were the center of doctrinal strife. Their leader, Victor Adler, had been in close touch with Engels. The party was still young, full of radicalism and idealism, and a good part of the young intelligentsia belonged to the movement, including many wealthy men who donated their fortunes to the party. The socialists were, even then, the strongest group in Austria, while in England and America there was not yet one single representative of this movement in the legislature. My father was, at that time, counsel in a number of political criminal trials that caused a great sensation. On the evening of one of his greatest trial successes, he said to me, "This empire is quite different from the rest of the world. Imagine the emperor and his government gone for even 1 year. The nationalities would tear each other to pieces. The government is the fence that separates the zoo of wild animals from the outside world, and nowhere else are there so many and such dangerous political beasts as we have." There was no exaggeration in these words. They represented the shrewd diagnosis of an experienced advocate, and they impressed me deeply. Unlike my contemporaries, I was free from that adulation of the masses, then beginning its domination of political thought. No more than 300 meters separated the university from the parliament building on the Vienna Ringstrasse. If the young people fought almost daily at the university, the conflicts of the deputies were of equal violence and were battled with a fanatical passion unknown in other countries. And if you went only 100 steps further on from Parliament, you could see every day, and usually more often, a carriage drawn by 2 horses drive out of the Hofburg. In it sat the old emperor and his equally elderly adjutant, and they would set out for Schönbrunn at an easy trot, always at the same hour and always down the same street. There was no security escort ahead of or behind the carriage, and no policeman sat in the vehicle itself. Any assassin would have had an easy job, but nobody took the opportunity. The leaders of our modern great empires are driven rapidly in bulletproof cars protected by countless bodyguards. Aristotle defined the difference between a monarch and a tyrant thus: The monarch protects his people. The tyrant has to protect himself from them. Every ideology that was later to cause the world untold grief for a half century and more was seething in Vienna during my student years. The struggle of various nationalities, Hitlerism, which was then called Pan-Germanism, communist Marxism, the new heathenism in the guise of the conflict against Rome, and anti-Semitism. Political science was for us less an academic subject than simply the life that went on around us.